Marcus Thompson checked his watch again as he sat in the hard wooden bench of courtroom 302. The clock on the wall ticked past 9:30 a.m., and the stuffy room was already packed with people from all walks of life. Some looked nervous, others appeared bored, but Marcus remained calm and collected. At 35, he had spent countless hours in courtrooms, though usually standing on the other side as a federal prosecutor. Today was different. Marcus had chosen to wear khakis and a blue button-down shirt instead of his usual crisp suit. He wasn't here to prosecute anyone. He was here to contest a ticket he knew was wrongly issued. As he waited, he thumbed through his carefully prepared evidence: photos of the intersection, a diagram of his car's position, and the original citation that claimed he had run a red light when the light had clearly been yellow. The bustling courtroom fell into a hushed silence as Judge William Barrett swept in, his black robes flowing behind him. The judge, a man in his early 60s with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had a reputation for running his traffic court like a well-oiled machine. Some called it efficient, others called it rushed justice. Marcus observed as Judge Barrett handled case after case: 10 minutes for a speeding ticket, 5 minutes for an illegal turn, 15 minutes for a parking dispute. The judge's pattern became clear. He barely looked at evidence, relied heavily on the police officer's testimony, and seemed more interested in clearing his docket than delivering justice. As he waited, Marcus struck up a quiet conversation with Sarah, an elderly woman sitting next to him who was there for a parking ticket. She shared stories about her grandchildren and mentioned how nervous she was about the fine. She was living on a fixed income. Marcus gave her some friendly advice about presenting her case, the kind of natural help one human being offers another. The court officer's voice rang out. Case number 247, Marcus Thompson. As Marcus stood, he noticed how Judge Barrett's eyes barely flickered up from his papers. A young police officer, Officer Reynolds, stood at the prosecutor's table, looking surprisingly unsure of himself. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus approached the defendant's podium. The familiar scent of old books and furniture polish filled his nostrils, the same smell present in every courthouse he'd ever entered. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Judge Barrett's pen scratched impatiently against his notepad, or how the judge's clerk kept glancing between Marcus and her boss with an odd expression. Marcus took a deep breath, remembering all the times he'd advised witnesses to stay calm and speak clearly. He could feel the weight of his evidence folder in his hands, the same way he'd felt the weight of his cases as a prosecutor. But today, he wasn't representing the United States government. He was simply a citizen seeking justice. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice clear and respectful. I'm here to contest citation number 2024-472, issued on February 15th at the intersection of Maple and 5th. He started to reach for his evidence folder, ready to present the photographs that would prove his innocence. But before he could continue, Judge Barrett raised his hand in a dismissive gesture. The judge's face wore an expression Marcus had seen before, the look of someone who had already made up their mind before hearing a single word of evidence. It was the very antithesis of what Marcus had dedicated his career to fighting against. Little did Judge Barrett know that his next few words would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of his courtroom and force an entire judicial district to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, bias, and the power of position. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor as Marcus prepared himself for what was about to unfold. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy as Marcus began presenting his case. He pulled out clear photographs of the intersection, but Judge Barrett barely glanced at them. Instead, the judge was looking somewhere above Marcus's head, as if the ceiling tiles were more interesting than the evidence being presented. Your Honor, if you'll look at this photo. Marcus started, but Judge Barrett cut him off with a wave of his hand. Mr. Thompson, I've heard enough excuses today, the judge said, his voice carrying a tone that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Let's keep this moving. Officer Reynolds, what's your account of the incident? The young police officer stood up, looking slightly uncomfortable. Sir, I observed the defendant's vehicle passing through the intersection at. He paused, glancing at his notes, then at Marcus, then back at the judge. We don't have all day, officer, Judge Barrett snapped, making Officer Reynolds jump slightly. Marcus noticed a pattern forming. When other people had presented their cases earlier, particularly the well-dressed white businessman who'd been there for a speeding ticket, Judge Barrett had listened patiently, even cracking a few jokes. Now, the judge's demeanor had shifted dramatically. Your Honor, Marcus tried again, his voice remaining professional despite the growing tension. I have video evidence from my dashboard camera that clearly shows. Mr. Thompson, Judge Barrett interrupted, leaning forward with narrowed eyes. Are you suggesting Officer Reynolds is lying? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Marcus could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. Sarah, the elderly woman he'd spoken with earlier, covered her mouth with her hand. The court clerk had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over her keyboard. Not at all, Your Honor, Marcus replied calmly. I'm simply presenting evidence that might help clarify the situation. As an officer of the court. An officer of the court. Judge Barrett's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Mr. Thompson, this is traffic court. Let's not pretend this is the Supreme Court. A few people in the gallery gasped quietly at the judge's tone. Even Officer Reynolds looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The court clerk was biting her lower lip, her eyes darting between Marcus and the judge. Marcus took a deep breath, remembering the countless times he dealt with difficult judges in federal cases. But this was different. The dismissive tone, the interruptions, the unwillingness to even look at the evidence. It all pointed to something more troubling than just a busy judge trying to clear his docket. Your Honor, I respectfully request that you review the evidence before making your decision, Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. He could feel a slight tremor in his hands, not from fear, but from controlled anger at the injustice unfolding. Judge Barrett's face reddened slightly. Mr. Thompson, I don't appreciate your tone. This is my courtroom, and I've been doing this long enough to know when someone is trying to waste the court's time. The words echoed off the wood-paneled walls. A young law student sitting in the back row was frantically taking notes, clearly recognizing that something unprecedented was happening. The bailiff, who had been standing motionless by the door, shifted his position slightly, sensing the growing tension. Marcus stood his ground, his evidence folder still open on the podium. He'd faced tough situations before, but this was personal. This wasn't about a traffic ticket anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that happened far too often in courtrooms across the country. The morning sun had moved higher now, casting harsh shadows across Judge Barrett's face as he prepared to deliver what he thought would be just another routine ruling. Neither he nor anyone else in the courtroom, except Marcus, knew that this moment would soon become a turning point in their local justice system. Judge Barrett shuffled his papers loudly, making a show of his impatience. The tension in the courtroom had reached a breaking point, with everyone watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion car crash they couldn't look away from. Mr. Thompson, Judge Barrett announced, his voice dripping with authority, based on the officer's testimony and your continued disrespect for this court, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $500, plus court costs. He banged his gavel before Marcus could even respond. Marcus felt his heart racing, not from fear, but from a deep sense of injustice. He'd seen that same look in Judge Barrett's eyes when he'd sentenced the Hispanic teenager to community service for a broken taillight earlier that morning. But the white college student with 3 speeding tickets had walked away with just a warning and a smile from the judge. Your Honor, Marcus spoke up, his voice clear and controlled. I need to make a statement for the record. He reached into his folder one last time, determined to document what was happening. Judge Barrett's face turned a deeper shade of red. Mr. Thompson, you're treading on very thin ice. The judge's knuckles turned white as he gripped his gavel. "One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt." The court clerk, a middle-aged woman named Linda, had stopped typing entirely. Her eyes were wide, and she kept looking between her computer screen and the scene playing out before her. Even Officer Reynolds looked like he wanted to disappear into the wood paneling behind him. Sarah, still sitting in the gallery, whispered to the person next to her, "This isn't right. I've been here all morning, and nobody else got treated like this." Several heads nodded in agreement, but they quickly looked down when Judge Barrett swept his stern gaze across the room. Marcus stood perfectly still, his mind racing through years of legal training. He knew every word, every action in this moment mattered. The young law student in the back was still scribbling frantically, probably realizing he was witnessing something that would never appear in his textbooks. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, "I understand your ruling. However, for the record, I'd like to submit this final piece of documentation." He held up a single piece of paper, watching as Judge Barrett's face contorted with anger at this continued defiance. "That's it." Judge Barrett slammed his gavel so hard that several people jumped in their seats. "Mr. Thompson, you are now in contempt of court." Bailiff. The bailiff, who had been watching everything with growing discomfort, took a reluctant step forward. He'd known Marcus from previous cases, but was now caught in an impossible situation. Linda, the court clerk, suddenly dropped her pen. The sharp clatter echoed through the silent courtroom as she bent to pick it up, deliberately taking her time. It was a small act of defiance, buying Marcus a few precious seconds. "Before you continue, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice somehow both respectful and unflinching, "I believe this documentation is pertinent to these proceedings." His hand, holding that single sheet of paper, remained steady. The morning sun had shifted, and now a beam of light fell directly on the document in Marcus's hand. The official letterhead was clearly visible to everyone in the first few rows. Several gasps echoed through the courtroom as people caught glimpses of the federal seal. Judge Barrett, too focused on his own authority to notice these details, raised his gavel one final time. "Bailiff, remove Mr. Thompson from my courtroom immediately, and add another $1,000 fine for contempt." The next few moments would become legendary in the courthouse, told and retold by everyone present, because that single sheet of paper in Marcus's hand was about to change everything, not just for him, but for every person who would ever step into Judge Barrett's courtroom again. The bailiff had just reached the podium when Linda's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Your Honor, I think you really need to see this." Linda's hands trembled slightly as she accepted Marcus's business card. The thick, cream-colored cardstock felt heavy in her fingers, heavier than any ordinary business card should feel. As her eyes scanned the text, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Assistant United States Attorney Marcus Thompson, Federal Prosecutor's Office, Department of Justice. The bailiff, who had just reached Marcus, glanced over Linda's shoulder. His hand, which had been reaching for Marcus's arm, dropped immediately to his side. A look of recognition crossed his face. He had seen Marcus before, but in very different circumstances, standing on the prosecution side in federal court wearing $1,000 suits. Judge Barrett, still red-faced and angry, noticed the sudden change in his courtroom staff's behavior. "What seems to be the problem?" he demanded, his voice carrying less authority now as uncertainty crept in. Linda cleared her throat. "Your Honor," she began, her voice stronger than she expected, "Mr. Thompson is, well, perhaps you should see this yourself." She walked the business card up to the bench, her sensible shoes clicking against the floor in the dead silence of the courtroom. The color drained from Judge Barrett's face as he read the card, then read it again. The gavel in his hand suddenly seemed very heavy. The judge looked up at Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time that morning. Really seeing him. Gone was the dismissive glare, replaced by something between shock and fear. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Barrett said, his voice notably softer, "why didn't you mention your position earlier?" Marcus stepped forward, his composure unchanged. "Your Honor, my position shouldn't matter. Every person who enters this courtroom deserves the same respect and fair treatment under the law. I watched you handle 12 cases before mine this morning. The pattern of your rulings was concerning." The young law student in the back had stopped writing, his jaw slightly open. Sarah and the other spectators leaned forward, not wanting to miss a word. Officer Reynolds looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Judge Barrett started, then stopped. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, he seemed at a loss for words. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people began connecting the dots. Some pulled out their phones, fingers flying as they typed messages about what they were witnessing. One older gentleman in the gallery nodded approvingly at Marcus, while a young woman wiped away tears. "The thing is, Your Honor," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "justice shouldn't depend on someone's job title, the color of their skin, or the clothes they wear. I could have come in here wearing my federal prosecutor's badge, but then I wouldn't have seen what others experience every day in this courtroom." Linda was still standing near the bench, clutching her stack of papers. In her 20 years as a court clerk, she had documented countless cases, but she knew this one would be different. This one would matter. Judge Barrett's hands moved to straighten his robes, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. "Mr. Thompson, in light of this new information—" "There is no new information, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted gently. "The evidence I tried to present hasn't changed. The facts of the case haven't changed. The only thing that's changed is your awareness of who I am." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old courthouse seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The morning sun had shifted again, and now it illuminated the words carved above the courtroom door, "Equal justice under law." More than one person glanced up at those words, their meaning suddenly more powerful than ever. Judge Barrett looked down at Marcus's business card again, knowing that his next words would have consequences far beyond this traffic case. What he didn't know was that his phone was already beginning to buzz in his chambers, as news of the incident started spreading through the courthouse like wildfire. Word spread through the courthouse like a summer wildfire. By afternoon, every judge, clerk, and janitor knew about what had happened in courtroom 302. Marcus's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from colleagues and reporters, but he silenced it and focused on his regular cases. 3 days later, Sarah Jenkins, the elderly woman from traffic court, sat in front of a panel of judicial investigators. Her hands clutched her worn purse as she described what she had witnessed. "I've been to that court 6 times over the years," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And every time, I watched Judge Barrett treat people differently based on how they looked. I just never thought anyone would believe me." The lead investigator, Maria Rodriguez, leaned forward in her chair. She had spent the past 72 hours reviewing hundreds of hours of courtroom footage. The images on her computer showed a clear pattern, one that made her stomach turn. White defendants averaged 3 minutes of speaking time. Minorities got less than 30 seconds. Maximum fines were given to people of color 80% more often. Down the hall, Officer Reynolds sat nervously in another room. "I tried to be fair with my tickets," he explained, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But when the judge keeps dismissing cases for certain people and hammering others, well, some officers just stopped bringing cases for anyone who looked like they'd get an easy pass. It felt wrong." Linda, the court clerk, had provided years of records. Her careful documentation showed how fines varied dramatically based on race, clothing, and perceived social status. "I kept these separate notes," she admitted, pushing forward a small notebook. "Every time something felt wrong, I wrote it down. I just didn't know what to do with the information." In the courthouse cafeteria, the young law student who had witnessed everything shared his detailed notes with other students. "It's like watching history happen," he said, pointing to his careful observations. "They teach us about bias in law school, but seeing it exposed like this—" His words trailed off as more students gathered around, taking pictures of his notes. Marcus sat in his federal office, reviewing the mounting evidence. Statistics filled his computer screen, numbers that told a story of systematic bias. Average fine amounts: $375 for minorities, $120 for white defendants. Contempt charges: 89% issued to people of color. The data painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. A local reporter, Diane Chen, worked late into the night, cross-referencing cases. She found families who had lost their licenses because they couldn't pay excessive fines. She discovered small businesses that had closed after their delivery drivers were repeatedly targeted. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. The courthouse security guard, watching old security tapes, noticed how Judge Barrett's body language changed depending on who stood before him. "Look here," he pointed out to investigators. "See how he leans back, crosses his arms when certain people approach. But with others, he's all smiles and friendly gestures." In the Judicial Review Board's office, phones rang constantly. Other judges from nearby counties called to report similar patterns they'd observed but hadn't confronted. Court watchers submitted years of handwritten notes, showing this wasn't just one judge's problem. It was a systemic issue that had gone unchecked for too long. As the sun set over the courthouse that Friday, Maria Rodriguez compiled her preliminary findings. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just about one traffic case or one federal prosecutor. It was about hundreds of people who had faced injustice, their stories finally coming to light. Back in his office, Marcus looked at a photo on his wall, his law school graduation day. He remembered promising to uphold justice equally for all. Now, because he had chosen to wear casual clothes to traffic court that day, a hidden system of bias was being exposed. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the Judicial Review Board. Tomorrow, they would begin formal hearings, and nothing in this courthouse would ever be the same. The hearing room felt smaller than usual as Judge Barrett faced the Judicial Review Board. The once confident judge now sat quietly, his shoulders slightly hunched, as Marcus Thompson approached the podium. Everyone expected anger, demands for punishment, or at least a harsh rebuke. What happened next surprised them all. "I'm not here to end a career," Marcus began, his voice calm and measured. "I'm here to change a system." The board members exchanged glances as Marcus pulled out a thick folder of documents. "These are proposals for mandatory bias training, new oversight procedures, and a complete overhaul of how we handle traffic court cases." Judge Barrett looked up, confusion clear on his face. He had spent the weekend expecting the worst. Instead, he was watching the very man he'd disrespected working to create positive change. First, Marcus continued, spreading out his papers. "We need transparent reporting of all fine amounts, broken down by race, gender, and economic status. These reports should be public, posted monthly." He passed copies to each board member, the papers rustling in the quiet room. In the back of the room, Sarah sat with other community members who had come forward to share their stories. She nudged her neighbor and whispered, "He's not just fighting for himself, he's fighting for all of us." Judge Barrett's hands trembled slightly as he listened. The evidence of his bias had been overwhelming. He'd spent sleepless nights reviewing his own actions, feeling the weight of years of unfair decisions crushing down on him. Now, watching Marcus present solutions instead of accusations, something shifted inside him. Additionally, Marcus explained, pointing to specific sections in his proposal, "We need a new system for reviewing contested tickets. Every defendant deserves at least 10 minutes to present their case. No more rushed judgments, no more dismissing evidence without review." Linda, the court clerk, took detailed notes from her seat near the wall. She smiled as Marcus mentioned creating a new position, a court bias observer who would track patterns and report concerns. It was the very role she had unofficially been filling for years. The young law student who had witnessed the original incident was now helping to draft new procedures. His laptop displayed statistics, charts, and proposals. "We're not just changing one courthouse," he told his classmates during breaks. "We're creating a model that could spread across the country." Outside the hearing room, Reporters gathered as word spread about the unprecedented changes being proposed. This wasn't a story about punishment. It was a story about transformation. Judge Barrett finally stood up to speak. His voice shook at first but grew stronger. "I've served on this bench for 15 years, he began, "and until last week, I would have sworn I treated everyone fairly." He paused, looking directly at Marcus. "I was wrong. I didn't see my own bias because I didn't want to see it." The room fell silent as Judge Barrett continued. "I'm not asking to keep my position without consequences. I'm asking for the chance to be part of the solution." He pulled out his own notes, pages of self-reflection and ideas for change. Marcus nodded encouragingly. This was exactly what he had hoped for. Not a broken judge, but one who could help fix a broken system. The review board chairperson leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting we combine your proposals with Judge Barrett's insights? Have him help implement these changes as part of his rehabilitation?" "Exactly," Marcus replied. "Who better to help identify and correct bias than someone who has confronted their own?" He turned to face the whole room. "This isn't about punishment. It's about progress." As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, the board members began their deliberations. Judge Barrett caught Marcus's eye and mouthed a silent "thank you." In that moment, everyone present understood they weren't just witnessing justice. They were watching justice evolve. The local news crews waited eagerly outside, knowing that whatever emerged from this room would change their community's justice system forever. But inside, the real work was already beginning. As people who had once been on opposite sides of justice now worked together to make it better for everyone. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the podium of the National Judicial Conference, facing a packed auditorium of judges, lawyers, and court officials from across the country. The spotlight felt warm on his face as he adjusted the microphone. "Change doesn't always come from dramatic confrontations," he began, gesturing to Judge Barrett, who sat in the front row. "Sometimes it comes from a simple traffic ticket and the courage to speak up." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. In the audience, Sarah sat proudly with her granddaughter, now a first-year law student inspired by what she had witnessed. They had become regular observers at traffic court, documenting the remarkable changes that had taken place over the past months. Judge Barrett stood up to join Marcus at the podium, looking different from that day 6 months ago. Gone was the arrogant authority figure. In his place stood a humbled man dedicated to change. "I used to think I was one of the good ones," he admitted to the silent audience. "I never used racial slurs, never thought of myself as prejudiced." But bias doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the little decisions we make every day. The large screen behind them displayed the results of their work. Traffic court fines had evened out across all demographics. Appeal rates had dropped by 60%. Most importantly, public trust in the court system had risen dramatically. Linda, now heading the new Court Observer program, smiled from her seat as she remembered the changes. Every judge now had a monitor tracking their ruling patterns. Weekly reviews caught potential bias before it became a pattern. The system wasn't perfect, but it was getting better. Last week, Marcus continued, a young man came to traffic court wearing saggy jeans and a hoodie. 6 months ago, he might have faced immediate judgment. Instead, Judge Barrett listened to his full story, reviewed his evidence, and made a fair ruling based on facts, not appearance. The young law student who had witnessed the original incident was now interning at the courthouse. He watched as other courts began adopting their new procedures. "It's like dropping a stone in a pond," he told a reporter. "The ripples just keep spreading." Judge Barrett stepped forward again. "I could have lost my job," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Instead, Mr. Thompson showed me something more valuable than punishment. He showed me how to be part of the solution." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. The presentation screen switched to show statistics from other courts that had adopted their program. Green arrows pointed upward, showing improvements in case resolution times, satisfaction rates, and trust scores. A judge from Texas stood up during the question period. But how do you handle the resistance? She asked. Change isn't easy. Marcus smiled. We invite the skeptics to sit in traffic court for one day. Just observe. Take notes. The patterns become clear when you're really looking for them. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded in agreement. As the conference drew to a close, Judge Barrett and Marcus stood together at the exit, shaking hands with their colleagues. You know, Judge Barrett said quietly, that traffic ticket was valid. You did run that yellow light. Marcus laughed. I know, but this was never about the ticket. It was about making sure every person who walks into a courtroom gets the same chance to be heard. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Judges and lawyers lingered on the steps, discussing how to implement similar changes in their own courts. Sarah hugged her granddaughter, knowing she would be part of this new generation of legal professionals who understood the importance of fairness. Back at their home courthouse, a new sign hung above the traffic court entrance. Justice sees no color, class, or clothing. Only facts. Below it, a line of people waited for their cases to be heard, each one knowing they would get their fair 10 minutes, their chance to present evidence, their opportunity for true justice. And somewhere in the city, a driver ran a yellow light, got a ticket, and knew that when they went to contest it, they would be judged not by their appearance or background, but by the simple facts of their case. That was the real victory, not just changing one judge or one court, but changing what people could expect from justice itself.